The war was supposed to be over. In the first days of May 1945, Germany was collapsing. Hitler was dead. Berlin had fallen. The Third Reich, the empire that once claimed it would last 1,000 years, was in ruins. But in the mountains of western Austria, the war refused to die. There, in the green valley near the village of Itter, stood a medieval fortress, Castle Itter. It was quiet, isolated, surrounded by pine forests and steep cliffs. But during the last years of the war, it had become a prison. The Nazis had turned it into a special compound for high-profile captives, former French politicians, generals, and resistance figures. Among them were men who had once led France itself, former Prime Ministers Édouard Daladier and Paul Reynaud, generals like Maurice Gamelin, and even the elder sister of Charles de Gaulle. They were prisoners of prestige, kept alive not for mercy but for bargaining. As Germany's defeat drew near, their guards grew desperate and unpredictable. Rumors spread through the prison that the SS intended to kill them before the Allies arrived, a final act of loyalty to a dead regime. By early May, the guards had abandoned their posts. Some fled toward Germany, others melted into the hills. The prisoners were left behind, trapped in the castle with limited food, surrounded by armed fanatics still roaming the area. They had no way out and no means to defend themselves. Then, against all odds, help came from the unlikeliest of places, the German army itself. In a nearby town, a Wehrmacht officer named Major Josef Gangl commanded a small detachment of soldiers. He was a career artillery officer, loyal to Germany but sickened by the SS and the crimes he had seen. By May 1945, his unit had stopped fighting for Hitler. Instead, they focused on protecting civilians from SS troops who were still killing defeatists and anyone trying to surrender. When Gangl heard rumors that French prisoners were stranded in a nearby castle, he made a decision that would change his life and end it. He would go to the Americans. That decision was treason. Under German law, even in collapse, cooperation with the enemy meant death. But Gangl no longer cared. He had seen what the SS had done to civilians. He had seen entire villages burned for defiance. If he could save a few lives before the end, it was worth it. Gangl took a white flag and drove toward the nearest American lines. He found them near the town of Kufstein, a small unit of the 23rd Tank Battalion of the U.S. 12th Armored Division. Their commander was Captain John Jack Lee Jr., a 27-year-old officer from New York. Lee was skeptical when a German major appeared, unarmed, asking for help. But when Gangl explained the situation, French prisoners trapped in a castle surrounded by SS, Lee didn't hesitate. The war was ending, but this wasn't about orders anymore. It was about people. Together, the two men, enemies by every definition, planned an operation, a rescue mission that should never have happened, a battle fought not for conquest, but for decency. They gathered what they could, a single American Sherman tank named Besotten Jenny, 14 American soldiers, and a dozen of Gangl's German men. That was all. Barely 30 men in total. They knew the SS units in the area numbered in the hundreds, but they went anyway. They drove toward Itter through empty villages and broken roads. Everywhere they passed, the signs of a dying war were visible. Burned out trucks, corpses on the roadside, the smell of smoke and spring grass. Civilians watched from windows, unsure who to fear more, the Americans or the SS. When they reached the castle, the French prisoners couldn't believe what they saw. American troops, yes, but also German soldiers in Wehrmacht grey, carrying rifles and fighting side by side. For men who had spent years in Nazi prisons, it was unthinkable. Enemies had become protectors. Inside the castle walls, the defenders prepared for what they knew was coming. SS units were regrouping nearby, angry, desperate men who refused to accept defeat. They had already executed their own comrades for surrendering. Now they were hunting anyone seen cooperating with the Allies. That night, the defenders of Castle Itter reinforced the gates, set up machine guns, and took positions along the walls. They had one tank, a few rifles, and the stone walls of a medieval fortress. Outside, hundreds of SS troops were gathering in the forest. The next morning, May 5th, 1945, the SS attacked. It was one of the last battles of World War II, and the only one in which Germans and Americans fought together, side by side, against the SS. The first shots came at dawn. Rifle fire echoed through the valley, bullets ricocheting off the castle stone. The defenders returned fire from the towers. The Sherman tank besotten. Jenny fired its cannon down the narrow road, blowing apart the first SS truck to approach. But there were too many of them. Wave after wave of black uniformed soldiers swarmed the approach, shouting oaths of revenge. They fired from trees, from rocks, from the ridges surrounding the castle. The air filled with smoke and the sound of gunfire. Inside the walls, French prisoners, former politicians now turned soldiers, grabbed rifles and joined the fight. They had spent years arguing in prison about France's failures, but now they fought together. By noon, the defenders were running low on ammunition. The Sherman tank had taken a direct hit, its gun disabled. The SS were pushing closer. Captain Lee and Major Gangle moved from wall to wall, shouting orders, keeping morale alive. They knew reinforcements might not come in time. Then, in the chaos, a sniper's bullet struck Major Gangle as he tried to move a wounded French prisoner to cover. He died instantly, killed not by Americans or Allies, but while defending them. The men fought on, American, German, and French soldiers, together in a castle surrounded by forest and death, holding out against an army that refused to surrender. They didn't know it then, but this battle, this strange defiant stand, would be remembered as the last battle of the European war, and it would end not in hatred, but in unity. Dawn broke over the Tyrolean mountains in a haze of smoke and spring mist. From the towers of Castle Itter, the defenders could see movement in the tree line, black shapes slipping between the pines. The SS had arrived in force. Captain Jack Lee climbed to the battlements, his uniform streaked with dust, his helmet dented from a near miss. Beside him stood one of his new allies, a German sergeant named Sepp Gangle, once a loyal soldier of the Wehrmacht, now branded a traitor by his own army. Together they watched as the first shots cracked through the valley. The echoes rolled off the mountains like thunder. There were fewer than 30 defenders in total, 14 Americans, a dozen German soldiers, and a handful of French prisoners who insisted on fighting. They were outnumbered at least 10 to 1, but retreat was impossible. Behind them were only cliffs and the forest. Ahead, an army of SS men still loyal to a cause that no longer existed. The French politicians turned soldiers, men who had once ruled a nation, now crouched behind stone walls with rifles in their hands. Paul Reynaud, who had been prime minister when France fell in 1940, fought alongside his old rival, Édouard Daladier. They had spent years blaming each other for France's defeat. Now, as bullets shattered the stone around them, none of that mattered. They were no longer leaders or enemies. They were just men trying to stay alive. The first assault came mid-morning. SS troops opened fire from the forest, advancing cautiously through the open slope that led to the castle gate. The Americans returned fire, the sound of their M1 rifles cutting through the noise. Gangel's men used captured German machine guns to sweep the tree line. One of them, a young corporal named Kurt Siegfried Schrader, called out targets in fluent English, shouting over the roar of gunfire. The old castle shook as artillery shells began to fall. Chunks of rock broke loose from the walls. The defenders ducked behind cover, firing between blasts. The Sherman tank, Besotten, Jenny, held the road below, its cannon flashing with every shot. Each explosion echoed through the valley, rattling the windows of the nearby village. For a while, the defenders held. But the SS were relentless, fanatics who refused to accept that the war was lost. They poured rifle fire into the walls, trying to force a breach. They were led by officers who had sworn oaths to Hitler himself, men who believed surrender was worse than death. Inside the castle, the French prisoners helped however they could. They carried ammunition, treated the wounded, and fetched water from the cisterns. Some cracked dark jokes, trying to keep morale alive. Others prayed silently. Captain Lee moved constantly, shouting orders, reloading weapons, checking every wall. He refused to let panic take hold. He knew that if even one man broke, the rest would follow. His calmness held the line together. By noon, the SS began closing in from the west, using the forest as cover. The defenders shifted positions, firing from windows and towers. One American soldier climbed to the roof with a sniper rifle, picking off men as they crawled through the undergrowth. Below him, the Sherman tank thundered again and again, until a lucky shot from a Panzerfaust struck its side. The explosion tore through the treads, setting the engine on fire. Besotten Jenny was done. The defenders had lost their only heavy weapon. The crew escaped the flames and joined the others inside the walls. Now they had only rifles, machine guns, and courage. As afternoon came, the battle grew desperate. The SS surrounded the castle completely. Bullets ripped through windows. The defenders fired until their rifles overheated. Then, for a while, the firing stopped. The forest fell silent again, an uneasy calm before the next wave. During that lull, Captain Lee found himself speaking to one of the French generals. The man asked if reinforcements were coming. Lee didn't know the answer. The nearest American unit was miles away and radio contact was unreliable. He simply said, "We'll hold until they get here." It was all he could promise. Below, in the courtyard, the surviving German soldiers reloaded their weapons. They were men who had grown up believing in duty and loyalty, but now that loyalty had changed. They were fighting not for a flag, but for redemption. Gangel's men knew that even if they survived, they would be branded traitors by their own army. But still, they fought. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, the SS renewed their attack. Hundreds of them surged forward, firing as they ran. Grenades exploded against the walls. The defenders fired from every window, every opening, the castle echoing with gunfire. Smoke filled the air, stinging their eyes. For a moment, it felt like the entire world had shrunk to those stone walls. A single outpost of resistance in a war that refused to die. Then came the sound everyone had been dreading, the gate splintering under the weight of explosives. Wood cracked, hinges snapped, and the heavy doors sagged inward. Through the smoke, black shapes began to appear. Captain Lee ordered his men back to the inner courtyard. He and Schrader took positions near the gate, firing into the smoke until the barrels of their rifles glowed red. One SS soldier made it through. He fell before he could take another step. Another tried to climb the wall and was thrown back by a burst of machine gun fire. The defenders were exhausted, running low on ammunition. Inside the castle, wounded men groaned. The French prisoners carried the injured to the great hall, turning it into an impromptu hospital. There was no morphine, no proper bandages, only torn shirts and whispered prayers. In the chaos, someone realized that Major Joseph Gangle was gone. He had been shot earlier in the day, killed while protecting one of the French hostages. When word spread among his men, they fell silent for a moment. Then, almost in unison, they fought harder. They would not let his sacrifice be wasted. As night fell, the castle was lit only by firelight and tracer rounds. The defenders were surrounded, exhausted, and nearly out of ammunition. Every man knew what it meant if the SS broke through. No quarter, no prisoners. They had seen what these men did to civilians. To them, surrender was not an option. The French prisoners, men who had spent years debating politics in their cells, now prepared to die beside their captors. It was a strange kind of unity, born out of desperation. In that moment, the world outside the castle no longer existed. There were no nations, no sides, no flags, only survival. And then, sometime after midnight, they heard it. A sound in the distance, engines, dozens of them. At first, they thought it was the SS bringing reinforcements. But then came another sound, the deep, unmistakable thump of American artillery. Shells exploded on the ridge beyond the forest. Flashes of light illuminated the tree line. The SS firing slowed, then stopped. Captain Lee climbed to the battlements, staring into the darkness. He saw shapes moving down the road, tanks, trucks, soldiers. Reinforcements. The Americans had come. The battle was over. The SS retreated into the woods, leaving their dead behind. At dawn, US troops reached the castle gates. Inside, they found a scene unlike anything they had seen in the war. Americans and Germans standing side by side, weapons still warm, the smell of smoke thick in the air. The last battle of Europe had been fought not between enemies, but together against a common evil. When the sun rose over Castle Itter on May 6, 1945, the world felt still for the first time in years. The gunfire had stopped. The air, once filled with the echo of battle, now carried only the sound of wind through the pines and the slow crackle of burning wood. For the defenders who had survived the night, the silence felt unreal. Many of them had not slept in days. They stood on the castle walls, staring at the wreckage, broken weapons, empty shell casings, the bodies of men who had refused to give up even as the war itself died around them. Captain Jack Lee walked through the courtyard, his boots crunching on stone and ash. He stopped by the burned-out remains of the Sherman tank Besotten Jenny, the same machine that had held the road through most of the fight. Its turret was blackened, its gun bent downward like the head of a tired soldier. Nearby, German and American troops worked together to bury the dead. No distinction was made between uniforms. The SS soldiers who had fallen were buried in the woods, but for the men who had defended the castle, the graves were dug side by side. For one day, the war's lines had disappeared. Among the dead was Major Joseph Gangle. the Wehrmacht officer who had defied his own army to save strangers. His men carried him into the courtyard and covered him with the German flag he had once fought under, not for the Reich, but for his people. An American chaplain said a quiet prayer over the body. No one spoke, even the French prisoners bowed their heads. Captain Lee stood silently beside the grave. He had seen hundreds of men die during the war, comrades, enemies, civilians. But this death was different. Gankel had chosen it. He had fought not because he had to, but because it was right. It was the kind of courage that crossed every border, every uniform, every language. Later, as the sun climbed higher, more American reinforcements arrived from the 142nd Infantry Regiment. They entered the valley cautiously, their rifles ready, expecting another ambush. But what they found stopped them cold. Germans and Americans sharing cigarettes, French officers sitting on broken walls, drinking coffee from tin cups, laughter echoing faintly in the distance. It was a sight that made no sense and yet explained everything. One soldier later said it looked less like a battlefield and more like the end of the world, as if the last survivors of some ancient war had simply decided to stop fighting. For the French prisoners, liberation came with disbelief. They had survived years of captivity, endured interrogation and isolation, and now found freedom through the help of men they had once considered enemies. When Allied reporters later asked them about the experience, they spoke of confusion, gratitude, and irony, that the people who had locked them away were not the same as those who had come to save them. Among them, the old rivalries faded quickly. Daladier and Reynaud, who had once been bitter political opponents, were seen sharing a cigarette on the castle wall, talking softly as if the last 5 years had never happened. Perhaps in that moment they both realized that the real victory was survival. By evening the wounded had been taken away, and the castle fell quiet again. The Americans were ordered to move on toward Innsbruck, where the final German units were surrendering. The Germans who had fought beside them were taken into custody, not as prisoners of war, but as allies who had helped end the fighting. It was an arrangement that would never happen again. Before they left, Captain Lee met with the leader of Gangel's surviving men. He thanked them for their bravery, promising that their actions would be remembered. The German sergeant simply nodded and said, "It was the right thing to do." That was all. When the convoy rolled out of the valley, Castle Itter stood silent once more. The smoke drifted from the burned gate, and the last echoes of gunfire faded into the hills. The war in Europe ended just 2 days later, but for the men who fought there, the memory of that day would never fade. It was the day when enemies became brothers, when soldiers who had been told to hate each other fought instead for something purer, the belief that humanity mattered more than the orders of dead men. In the years that followed, the story of Castle Itter was nearly forgotten. For decades, it remained a footnote in military history, a strange anomaly, too small to be called a battle, too meaningful to be ignored. Official reports called it an isolated engagement, but those who were there knew better. One French prisoner later wrote, "We had lived for years surrounded by hate and betrayal. At Castle Itter, we saw courage, not of one side, but of men who refused to be part of evil anymore." For Captain Jack Lee, the war ended with a medal and a memory he could never escape. He was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for his leadership at Castle Itter. But when asked about the battle years later, he rarely spoke of the honor. Instead, he spoke of Gankel, the German major who gave his life to save men he didn't know. I never met a braver man, Lee said simply. He died for what was right. Gangl was declared a national hero in Austria, one of the few Wehrmacht officers officially recognized for his resistance to the SS. A street in his hometown was later named after him. For his men, his name became a symbol of the war's final truth, that even in its darkest hour, there were still men willing to do good. The battle for Castle Itter lasted less than 24 hours, but its legacy endures as one of the most remarkable moments in World War II. Not because of strategy or victory, but because of what it revealed about human nature. In a war defined by cruelty, this small fight in the Austrian mountains showed something different, the possibility of redemption. As historians later studied the battle, they called it the strangest alliance of the war. And perhaps it was. But to those who were there, it wasn't strange at all. It was necessary. That night, as darkness fell over the valley again, the castle stood silent, its walls scarred, its stones stained by smoke and blood. But in that silence, something sacred lingered. Not the memory of death, but the memory of unity. The war had taken everything from these men, their youth, their homes, their faith. Yet, for one final day, they gave the world something back, proof that even in hell there can be decency. And when the last light faded from the castle's windows, the valley of Itter returned to peace, a peace bought not by orders, but by courage. When the guns fell silent in Europe, the world began to rebuild. But amid the ruins, there were stories too small, too strange, or too human to fit into history books. The battle for Castle Itter was one of them. It was officially just another skirmish at the end of the war. There were no grand armies, no sweeping offensives, no generals moving markers on a map, only a handful of men who refused to surrender to madness. And yet, what they did inside that castle would become one of the most extraordinary moments of the 20th century. For the soldiers who survived, life went on, but the memory never left them. Captain Jack Lee returned to America, decorated but restless. He had fought across Europe, but nothing compared to that final battle in the Austrian mountains. When asked later what it felt like to fight alongside Germans, he said, "It felt right. We weren't enemies anymore, we were just men trying to stop the killing." He rarely spoke about the medals he earned or the headlines that briefly mentioned him. What stayed with him were the faces, the men who had stood shoulder to shoulder behind crumbling walls, sharing ammunition and fear. The young German soldiers who had chosen conscience over orders. The French prisoners who had fought for their lives, then shared bread with their rescuers. Major Joseph Gangl never lived to see that peace. But in Austria, his name became legend. His townspeople, once wary of speaking about the war, began to tell his story again, of how a German officer defied the SS to save innocent lives. In his hometown of Wörgl, a street now bears his name. Each year, on the anniversary of his death, flowers are laid at his memorial. Children are taught that courage isn't about obedience, it's about choice. But for decades outside Austria, no one knew the story. The chaos of post-war Europe buried it. The world was too busy rebuilding to remember one castle and 30 men. There were new battles, new wars, new lines drawn across the world. The story of Castle Itter faded into silence. It wasn't until years later, when military historians began combing through declassified documents, that the story resurfaced. Old reports describe the event almost in disbelief. American and German troops fighting together against the SS. To many, it sounded like myth, but the records were clear. It had happened. The last battle of Europe had been fought by enemies turned allies. When word of the battle spread again in the 1990s, journalists and historians began to visit the site. Castle Itter still stood high on its hill above the village. Its walls were pocked with bullet holes. The gate bore the scars of explosions. Inside, the courtyard where Germans and Americans had once stood together remained quiet. Visitors described a strange feeling when they entered, as if the air itself carried the memory of that day. The sound of wind through the trees seemed softer there, the silence heavier. Even now, decades later, it was impossible to stand in that place and not feel the weight of what had happened. The locals in Itter still tell the story. They speak of the strange battle fought at the end of the world, a battle where no one fought for flags, only for each other. Some say the castle is haunted, not by ghosts, but by the echo of voices, the laughter of men who survived, the shouts of those who refused to give up, the whisper of a language that no longer mattered. If you visit today, you'll see little that hints at its past. The castle has changed hands many times. At one point, it was even a private residence. But if you know where to look, you can still see the scars, the marks of bullets in the stone, the faded impressions of sandbags, the gate that once shattered under fire. They remain like quiet signatures of the men who stood there. In 2013, nearly 70 years after the battle, an American author named Stephen Harding published The Last Battle, a book that finally told the full story. It became the first complete account in English, based on military records and eyewitness testimony. Through it, the world finally learned the names of the men who had stood together in the war's final hours. And when people read it, many couldn't believe it was true. Because in a war defined by hatred and betrayal, this story sounded impossible. But that impossibility was what made it matter. The battle for Castle Itter wasn't just an odd event, it was a mirror held up to humanity. It showed that even at the edge of destruction, decency could still exist. That after 6 years of blood and fear, there were still people willing to choose compassion over obedience. In that moment, the uniforms didn't matter anymore, only courage did. It's easy to forget how fragile that moment was. One wrong decision, one spark of mistrust, and it could have ended in massacre. But it didn't. Because for one day, just one day, the world remembered what it was fighting for. For Captain Lee, the memory of that unity stayed with him until his death. In his final years, when asked about the war, he would talk about the men of Castle Itter. He said they were the bravest soldiers he ever knew. Not because they won, but because they refused to hate. For the German soldiers who survived, life after the war was not easy. Many faced suspicion or silence. Some were taken into Allied custody, others returned home to shattered towns and broken families. But in quiet corners of Austria, people remembered what they had done. They remembered how these men, once part of an army feared across the world, had turned their weapons against their own to protect the innocent. Even now, decades later, the story remains almost unknown outside those who search for it. There are no Hollywood films about it, no grand memorials, no parades, only the castle standing in silence, watching over the valley. And maybe that's how it should be, because Castle Itter wasn't a story of glory. It was a story of conscience. It wasn't about victory, but about redemption. It reminds us that history isn't made only by generals and politicians. Sometimes it's made by a few tired soldiers who decide to do what's right, even when everything tells them not to. When we look back on World War II, we often see it in absolutes: good versus evil, allies versus axis, heroes versus villains. But the truth is more complicated. There were men on every side who made terrible choices, and others who found redemption at the very end. The defenders of Castle Itter were proof of that. Their story doesn't fit neatly into textbooks, but maybe that's the point. It reminds us that even in war, the capacity for good never disappears. It only gets buried under fear and orders. Sometimes it just takes one moment of courage to bring it back to the surface. When the last of the veterans passed away, the story might have vanished with them. But thanks to those who remembered, the villagers, the historians, the families, the memory lives on. And maybe that's enough, because every time someone tells the story of Castle Itter, they keep that moment alive. That fleeting instant in the chaos of history when enemies stood together, not out of strategy, but out of humanity. In the grand timeline of war, it was only one day. But that one day was enough to show what humanity is capable of, both its worst and its best. When the wind blows through the pines above the castle today, it carries the same sound it did in 1945. The soft hum of peace, fragile and precious. And if you listen closely, you might still hear echoes of that battle. Not the gunfire, not the shouting, but the quiet defiance of men who refused to surrender their souls, even when the world around them had already surrendered its sanity